How dangerous did law enforcement really believe that Bryan Kohberger was if they just allowed him to wander around between two colleges and then set off on a 2,500-mile road trip outside of the state of Idaho? Hey everyone, it's Lucky with Unfiltered Lucky. And today I want to talk a little bit about the 30 days of surveillance of Bryan Kohberger before he was finally arrested in the end of December. Now, on November 25th, it's reported that law enforcement and investigators put out an alert to law enforcement to be on the lookout for this four-door white Hyundai Elantra. Well, only a few days later, Washington State University police locate a 2015 white four-door Hyundai Elantra. Now, this car is connected to Bryan Kohberger. Now, this is in the end of November. So Bryan Kohberger was on law enforcement's radar in the end of November. Now, why didn't law enforcement just pull Bryan Kohberger in and question him at that time? It seems like that would have been the standard procedure since law enforcement was looking for individuals connected to this car because they wanted to talk to them about these crimes. So why didn't law enforcement just simply pull Bryan Kohberger in and ask him a few questions? Instead, they decided to follow him and surveil Bryan Kohberger. Now, law enforcement believed that Bryan Kohberger was dangerous enough to take the lives of 4 young college students with a sharp-edged blade in a very, very messy crime scene. But yet they allowed Bryan Kohberger to continue to move around freely between 2 colleges in 2 college towns and basically just watched him. They never brought him in for questioning. They just basically allowed him to move around between Pullman, Washington, and Moscow, Idaho freely, believing that he was extremely dangerous. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So it doesn't make a lot of sense that they just kind of let him roam around in between the 2 colleges, believing that he was extremely dangerous. But then they allow him to leave the state of Idaho and go on a road trip. He's going back home for the holidays, 2,500 miles away. So now law enforcement follows Bryan Kohberger all the way back home to Pennsylvania, 2,500 miles away. So this man, who law enforcement believes took the lives of these 4 young people in a very, very brutal manner, is allowed to just travel around freely. So they follow Bryan Kohberger 2,500 miles back to Pennsylvania, and it's also reported that they do lose track of Bryan Kohberger for a number of hours, which reportedly causes them to panic a little bit, which would make sense. I mean, you have a very dangerous man, allegedly, driving across country. And, so once Bryan Kohberger gets home to Pennsylvania, they set up surveillance and begin watching Bryan Kohberger's actions. Now, is it possible that they decided to follow Bryan Kohberger rather than bring him in for questioning because law enforcement maybe thought that Brian Koberger was going to lead them to something. Maybe he was going to lead them to more suspects. So they felt like they needed to follow him and, see where he led them to. I mean, that's a possibility. But anyone who can take the lives of 4 individuals with a sharp-edged blade is extremely dangerous. It seems silly that law enforcement would allow this person to be out in the public freely if they truly believe that this man is that dangerous. It just really doesn't make sense. It's also been reported that Brian Koberger was, doing some strange things as they were observing him at his home. One thing that they claimed that he was doing was separating his garbage into Ziploc baggies while wearing, nitrile gloves. They almost make it sound like Brian Koberger never took the gloves off the whole time that they were watching him at his parents' house. That he was throwing the trash with nitrile gloves on, that he was separating his garbage with nitrile gloves on. They almost make it sound like he never took these gloves off. And so, Brian Koberger separating his trash into Ziploc baggies, if he was observed doing this, why didn't law enforcement get garbage that had belonged to Brian Koberger? Why did they settle for garbage that was Brian Koberger's dad's? It just seems strange that rather than just question Brian Koberger in Moscow, Idaho, they would follow him across country and just watch and wait. Law enforcement at this time believes this is a very, very dangerous individual. Now, they're watching him at his house in Pennsylvania. And when they decide, when they finally get the tip about, the DNA, when the DNA comes back and they finally get this tip that there's a match to Brian Koberger, they basically go in and storm the house, like they're taking down El Chapo. In my opinion, a lot of this is for show. In my opinion, I think following him across country and, all of this surveillance and all of this stuff, in my opinion, seems like it's all for show. Did they really need to storm Brian Koberger's house? After they surveilled the house for a couple of days, I think they probably had a pretty good idea that, there wasn't, that they weren't storming, a major kingpin's home or, something like that. It seems to me like, why wouldn't they just arrest Brian Koberger while he was out by the garbage can outside of his house? It's just never made sense to me, the whole 30 days time before they actually arrested Brian Koberger. They never brought him in for questioning. That's strange to me, that they would just allow this man who they believe is capable of committing these heinous crimes to just wander around freely. It just really doesn't make sense that they would allow him to do that. And then the extradition and, everything else. It all just, to me, seems like a show. Was Brian Koberger aware that he was under surveillance? It's very possible that Brian Koberger could have known that he was under surveillance. Yeah, investigators, are educated in surveillance and gathering evidence. But so is Bryan Kohberger. So it's very possible that Bryan Kohberger could have known that he was under surveillance. Maybe, getting pulled over 2 times in a row on his road trip back to Pennsylvania, maybe that gave him a heads up that he was under surveillance. One of the questions that's been asked a lot is, was Bryan Kohberger's car equipped with GPS? And if Bryan Kohberger's car was equipped with GPS, why didn't law enforcement just go into his GPS records rather than doing the whole cell phone tower thing? So that's a question that a lot of people have asked, is about, did Bryan Kohberger's vehicle have GPS? And in one of the times when Bryan Kohberger gets pulled over, you can actually see Bryan Kohberger's dad's cell phone, and it looks like he's looking at GPS from his own cell phone. So it doesn't appear that they would be using GPS, because you don't see it on the screen on Bryan Kohberger's dash. His dad is navigating from his phone. So is there, did Bryan Kohberger's car, was it equipped with GPS? And maybe Bryan Kohberger, wasn't using it for a reason. And his dad was using the GPS from his phone. That might indicate that Bryan Kohberger knew that he was under surveillance. Bryan Kohberger separating his garbage into Ziploc baggies, and dispersing it around the neighborhood might give law enforcement the indication that he's aware that he's under surveillance. So it's very possible that Bryan Kohberger knew that he was under surveillance by law enforcement. But it's never made sense to me that that Bryan Kohberger was on law enforcement's radar in the end of November, just a few weeks after the crimes occurred. But they chose not to question Bryan Kohberger. They just chose to follow him around for a month and allow who they believe is this dangerous individual to just roam around, college campuses, and eventually take a 2,500-mile trip back home to Pennsylvania. It just doesn't make sense. But stay tuned for my next video, and please and please subscribe to my channel if you like my content. I really do appreciate it. We'll see you next time.